morning, everyone. And so I think that I am very fortunate in that I not only get to listen to this amazing duo of just intellectual power here, but I actually get to be the interlocutor. And so I'm counting myself blessed this morning. And so I want us to just jump right into this. We have had individually a lot of phone calls and a lot of text messages and a lot of discussions about what's going on, very many of them that prefaced the things that we're seeing now. I remember us having conversations. I was at Tulsa at the commemoration of the massacre there. So that was 2021. And you and I were talking about things that are happening in 2025 that hadn't happened yet. And you know, Nikole, you and I have been in these dialogues and so on. And so I'll just start with asking, in what ways do you see the attacks on critical race theory and on the 1619 Project as significant in their own right? Like, why do you think those attacks happened as they did? And how do you think that they factor into the subsequent things that we've seen in terms of the attacks on higher education?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm just thrilled that we're having this conversation. We've all talked about these attacks as they were unfolding. We were clear that the attack on critical race theory in 1619 wasn't just an attack on those specific projects. It was an attack on the entire project of the latter part of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century. It was an attack on the consensus, however loosely we might describe the consensus, that the past was not to be repeated, that enslavement was a contradiction with the constitutional values coming out of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. We understood that it was an attack on the very infrastructure, namely the capacity to bring cases, to assert rights, and it was an attack on the knowledge that was necessary to sustain our democracy. I think what I see happening now is, first of all, the belated realization that what we were saying was true. Mm-hmm. For the most part, I got a sense of denial, and I'm not just talking about the faction in this country that was willing to break the democracy in order to sustain a commitment to white supremacy. I'm talking about the folks on our side of the line, mm-hmm. who were willing to say it's just a distraction, or it's just about this project or this book, rather than it was about the entire project. Everything about our history tells us that our democracy and anti-racism go hand in hand. When one falters, the other one falls. And that's a message that has been lost. It's been lost historically because of the lost cause. It's been lost in storytelling because of Birth of a Nation and its progeny. And what we have to be about is using all of our faculties, including art, to retell the narrative that actually identifies racism as the Achilles heel of American democracy.
So that line from Du Bois where he said, America will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy America?
Absolutely.
Just one other thing before, Nikole, if you give me 1 second, I want to follow up on something that Kim said, which is, you know, there is the ratcheting up of the temperature and kind of noticing that what's happening. And then there is the sounding the alarm. And you and I have talked about this. The reaction that you get is, I mean, I get, but isn't that a little bit much? Or is it really going to be this thing? Or, I mean, all of us saw the conversation between Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi where he was like, history is too determinative, right? Meanwhile, it was like, the shit is happening again.
Right now.
I'm sorry, I wasn't supposed to say that. But Kim, like, how do you navigate that, or how does that factor into where we are?
Yeah, one part of it is that it's kind of revealing some of the conditions of critical race theory's possibility, because as I discussed with you, the first big fight that we had as legal scholars who studied the way that racial disempowerment is repeated over time through its embodiment in law, through the way that it facilitates, as Deborah Archer said yesterday, the fact that the very geography that we live in is a testament, is a monument to white supremacy. Law provides the software for that material inequality to constantly be reproduced. And so that's what we were talking about. And even our progressives, our critical folks, our radicals, were deeply discomforted by that conversation. They actually said, if you continue this, it's gonna repeat what happened in SNCC. Like everybody in that room had been participating in SNCC. No, that wasn't the reality. But the discomfort with dealing with the way that race is a condition of this republic's possibility, the theft of land, the theft of labor, the theft of reproductive autonomy, all of that is very discomforting across the board. When we have no capacity to talk about that, even within those who believe themselves to be holders of democratic ideals, that weakness becomes the opportunistic space where white supremacy, white Christian nationalism comes to the center of American politics. So now we're in a moment where there are those who are willing to say, can we just negotiate? Can we just find common ground? Personally, I can't find common ground with people who never wanted me to be part of this democracy and still don't. But that unwillingness to stand firm in these particular ideals is the unwillingness that I believe has brought us to this particular moment.
Nikole, can you talk a little bit about 1619 and how history factors into this? And I mean, there's a lot. We could just start with that.
Okay, sure. Hey everyone. Honored to be on stage with you all as always. Grateful we can still have these conversations somewhere in America, because the space for these conversations is becoming increasingly limited. You know, I guess I first want to say, I know this is true of both of you. I take no pleasure in being right.
Yes.
I actually wish we had been wrong. And the fact that many of us who study history were constantly trying to raise the alarm about what this country is capable of, because when you understand history, then you know. And this mythology of American exceptionalism has led us to believe that we are uniquely inoculated to autocracy, to fascism, to authoritarianism, when, you know, fascism began here and in colonialism. So that's not the question, but I just want to say, like, it has been so deeply frustrating and disturbing to have continuously tried to write into the world an understanding of what was possible, and to be constantly dismissed as hyperbolic, as biased, as, you know, wanting to see everything through the lens of race. What's clear is that our foes understand race and the way that it rules this country far more than our allies do.
That's right. That's right.
They are very clear on how salient race is, and how race can be that factor that will push people to vote against what we believe are their own best interests, without understanding that whiteness is the interest. So that frustration of us trying to help our allies understand how central race is to the United States and our politics, that there is no politics without race in the United States, and our foes get that intrinsically. Like, that is how they're governing. You know, 1619 understood what all of us understood, and also, again, what our adversaries understand, is that he who controls the narrative controls the policies. that we are always in a narrative war. That's why the first things that autocratic administrations do is they try to wrest control of historical narrative so that they can control how we understand the society that we're in today. And so, of course, the power of 1619 was trying to take away that narrative of American exceptionalism, this idea that we began in 1776 with this concept of liberty, and saying, no, we actually need to go back further, and we need to understand that slavery and freedom exist at the same time. And in fact, white notions of freedom are predicated on them depriving Black people and others of freedom. And when the project came out, and there was initially just typical conservative backlash, and then it became clear that it was going into schools. And once it became clear that educators were teaching it, that's when we saw really orchestrated backlash. And I don't know that I've ever told the story publicly, but Sean Wilentz, who was one of the 5 white historians who, main complaint was, how dare someone create this project and not consult us, which they literally said, we didn't know this was coming. I didn't know I had to ask your permission. And I have to admit to my own naivete. Because I was like, how the hell can you run against 1619? It's a newspaper project. Like, how can this become part of an electoral campaign? So even I was naive to that, because that's exactly what they did. And I know Kim understands this. When the attacks were coming against the project, when the first anti-CRT bills were actually anti-1619 project bills. There was a federal bill called the Saving American History Act. There were state legislative bans, school board bans, and there was very little pushback, almost complete silence.
That's right.
And I was like, it's not about the 1619 project. It is not going to stop here. But what they do, of course, is they test to see what can they get away with. Mm-hmm. And when not even our free speech allies spoke up against the 1619 bans, and they were explicit, this is our plan. Mm-hmm. I'm putting the plan on Twitter. Mm-hmm. And our colleagues in media were still giving the benefit of the doubt, like, oh no, parents are really actually concerned. That's because they were concerned. Mm-hmm. They were uncomfortable as well with the narratives. And then anti-CRT now transformed into what they're calling anti-DEI, which is really anti-civil rights. Mm-hmm. And we are now in the midst, as Kimberlé said, the history wars, erasing history is about erasing our rights. That is why they're doing it. So these things are in tandem as they are erasing, images, as they're taking down pictures first, trying to control how we talk about history at national parks, as they're removing books from shelves. They're also legislating against our rights. Mm-hmm. They are gutting the ability to enforce the Civil Rights Act. They're turning 14th Amendment civil rights laws against the people they were created for. And of course now intend to completely gut the last provision that protects our voting rights. So I think we willfully have not understood that. And my work has always been not about trying to convince Republicans of anything. It's been trying to convince our non-Black so-called allies. Mm. And I have to say, apparently we have failed.
Mm. There's a lot.
That was a lot. I wasn't trying to encapsulate an entire lecture in 5 minutes. But I'm also, I'm angry. I just am we can sit here and try to be academic. I'm so irate right now because what that Ezra and Ta-Nehisi video encapsulated is that we are to be blamed, mm-hmm. we are to be discarded, and they just want to make peace with each other.
Yes.
I'm throwing out a bit of contextual information. I'm trying to give you the alley-oop, so thank you. But backstage, we were talking about David Blight's Race and Reunion.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk about how that factors into how you see this moment, both of you, how you see this moment and the way that it relates to these past cycles of history?
Well, I mean, look, when we talk about we've been here before, where we have been is precisely in the moment when one group decides that they'd rather create the bonds, recreate the bonds, rather than to continue to carry the burden, basically, of the dispossessed. David Blight, Race and Reunion, and also Eric Foner, they all talk about how the end of Reconstruction wasn't the real end. The end comes in the 1900s. The end comes in 1915 during the Progressive Era, where under the guise of progressivism, the two sides come together and decide, this was a quarrel forgotten. So the fact that one faction in this country was willing to break it, to take up arms against it, and the fact that African Americans in particular saved the Union by having a massive strike, a labor strike, escaping to the Union lines, actually delivering victory. That was part of the quarrel forgotten. That was those people and their rights just go under the bus, so that in fact the whole notion of the lost cause actually has a political reality to it, right? So to actually come back together again to affirm the idea that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. That was a post-war justification. That wasn't even what they said at the time.
What they said at the time.
That's not even what they said. To affirm the idea that it was an honorable war, to affirm the idea that Reconstruction was an assault on white people. All of this was basically the side that prosecuted the war saying, you know what, we're giving in, and we're going to let this argument sustain itself. What happened to black people as a consequence of that? There was nearly a century of racial tyranny. So when Langston Hughes says, you don't have to tell the Negro what fascism is, we know it. So we're in this moment now when, there have been so many conversations, are we there yet? And people look to Europe to answer that question. What? What do you mean looking to Europe? That is what our history was. And as you just said, we were the inspiration for much of what actually got exported. But we have not brought that lesson home. So when our allies are unwilling to say that these appeals to, well, can't we find a way to compromise? When we hear it, we know that they're talking about compromising us again. They're talking about throwing us under the bus again. And I will say that in some of the progressive spaces that are organizing, I've noticed an absenteeism around questions of racial justice. There are all sorts of issues that are listed, including NATO. Okay, cool. We can talk about NATO, but we're not going to talk about the denial.
NATO, not Negro.
Yes, exactly. So, if we're not learning from that history, then we're bound to repeat it. And what Nikole said was 100% right. The faction that wants to reinstall racial hierarchy understands the importance of our history more than we do.
That's right.
So when they went after work in the African American Studies curriculum, and I was talking to people who were behind that and saying, okay, how are we going to fight? And they were basically willing to compromise, thinking that, well, history is history, people will get it. No, they won't. And that's what the right understands. It's all the reason why we have to do everything possible to fight them in the classroom, as well as the courtroom, in the memory, as well as in the actual material realities that we're facing.
I'll say something, one quick thing. I want to give this, to Nikole. One thing that I will take note of is that when these curricular bans were being imposed and we started seeing the earliest iterations of this, I will give respect because Ava DuVernay made all of their work available for people so that they would not be able to say, this is something that you cannot get in your school, therefore you do not have access to it. And so we are actually recognizing, the game plan. Some of us see how this is going, and we're recognizing and making the counter strategies that will preserve some shred of democracy. But Nikole, I wanted to give this to you to respond to the question as well.
Yeah, I mean, Race and Reunion is one of my favorite books because I'm clearly very interested in memory. 1619 is a project of memory more than anything else. And I've been recommending the book to people I really think need to read it, but also realizing, because I mean, I can't sum it up really any better than Kimberlé, but what was so fascinating to me was to understand the way that our entire remembrance of the Civil War, its causes, the result of the Civil War. The Civil War was called the aftermath was the second founding, because that was the time we briefly actually tried to be the country of those ideals that those slave owners put out in our founding documents. And so I always understood that that history of Reconstruction had to be erased, because otherwise you have no justification for the 8 decades of racial apartheid that comes after, right? The justification is that we had no choice. Well, we did, and we could have chosen something else. And I think the reason that is so important for us to understand now is we are in that moment again. We are in another nadir, I fear, and we are in another moment of choice, where people are saying, this is where we're going, this is the danger of the moment, and we're pretending that our reality is not being remade in real time, and it is. And I think the most depressing part of that book is so there's this other book, it's called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Mm-hmm. It's one of the few books I've read twice, because I never feel like I have time to reread books. And I remember towards the end of that book, when Indigenous people were simply just trying to survive. At that point, they're like, just tell us what you want from us and we will do it. And the answer was, we don't want you to exist.
Yes.
That there is nothing you can do to accommodate us. And I feel in this moment something very similar to that. When we're being told again by our allies, just disappear, just be quiet, just don't talk about those things, because we have to make peace with people who have said explicitly, we don't believe in democracy. Mm-hmm. If democracy is to be multiracial, we don't want it. Mm-hmm. We don't care if we have a dictator. People need to be punished, and we're being told, and not just us, obviously the targets on the trans community, which are very specific and very intentional as you take these most marginalized groups. And so when I'm thinking about Race and Reunion, it's like you just see it happening. But you see it happening, and not that people don't know the history, they're just dismissing it. And what do we do in that moment? We are up against this perpetual reality that we are 13% of the population, that we can't do anything without building coalition. And we are forced to build coalition with folks who are willing to trade our rights and humanity in order to make peace. And I just feel completely trapped. I don't know what we do except resist, because Black folks have always done that. But we have to be very clear-eyed about what that means in the duration. And I've constantly heard folks who are like, well, Black folks have survived worse before. A lot of us don't survive worse. Mm-hmm. And at some point after 400 years, can we not have to be trying to survive our own country? That's all I got, y'all. I'm
So I think, when I would talk with students, particularly when I was still teaching in a history department, I would say the first Black person that got a PhD from Harvard was W.E.B. Du Bois, got his PhD in history. Second Black person that got a PhD from Harvard was Carter G. Woodson, also got his PhD in history. And with all the availability, all the subject matter, the first 2 Black doctorates that are granted by that university are both to historians. And why is that? And it was because they understood that the battles around history were not about the past, that history was being deployed in order to rationalize politics of the present and of the future. Both Du Bois and Woodson were born in the midst of Reconstruction. Both of them saw Reconstruction snatched out of the hands, the momentary democracy snatched out of the hands of the formerly enslaved people, and the imposition of an American racial hierarchy, the proto-fascist hierarchy. And so I think that when we talk about this, we have to think about what we do as narrative makers, as writers, as scholars, and so on. And I wonder if there is a kind of clarity that has come from this, a kind of recognition in your own work, a kind of sense of what history informs for us to do in this moment.
Okay, yes. I'm gonna be less angry in this answer.
Nikole, I've known you a long time.
Ta-Nehisi's always like, when you start enunciating a lot, that's when I know you're upset. So, I talked about this on Cannonball Wesley Morris's podcast, that I've been thinking for years now, but really been thinking somewhat obsessively about what it felt like to be Thurgood Marshall and go on to the Supreme Court. So, of course, Thurgood Marshall brings Brown v. Board, which is the nail in the coffin to legal racial apartheid in the United States. He becomes the first black man on the court, and then will spend his entire tenure on that court writing dissents. But also writing dissents against cases that are being brought off of Brown, right? Off of the precedent that he helped make, and having to sit on this court with folks who are literally undoing his legacy while he sat on the bench.
Yes.
And I've thought so much. I mean, I've wanted to write about it. I never have, in a book that never finished, but we won't talk about that.
Just say yet.
Yet. And I feel like that I do have clarity. Like, I understand for such a time as this, that this is what I have been working towards, unfortunately, my entire career, and that I will likely spend the rest of my career writing dissent. And that's okay, because when Brown is overturned, it's based on the dissent of John Marshall Harlan, the lone dissenter in Plessy v. Ferguson. And that dissent is then used as precedent to overturn segregation. And so that bearing witness and that writing dissent against the injustice that we see is writing for a future that we know will come. And so I have to stop myself from feeling utterly hopeless in this moment, understand that I am writing for a future that will come. And these folks are not gonna be able to pretend that they didn't do what they did, that they didn't choose to do what they did, and that we weren't fighting against it the entire time.
Yeah.
Kim?
So we should come together and write this thing about Thurgood Marshall, because I have thought often, what did Thurgood Marshall think when he retired and he was replaced by someone who was committed to undoing his legacy? And by the end of it, most of the people he was advocating for were on the other side. I just wonder what that was like, for him not to be able to leave this earth knowing that his legacy was in good hands. And it was partly because we didn't understand, and by we I mean, the civil rights constituency. So a story for a future time. As I think about the clarity, there are times when people keep telling you that you're exaggerating, that you have to go back and say, well, am I? Am I? Until it becomes clear that you were absolutely right because they tell you that you were right. So there's that long list of words that can no longer be spoken, including race, racism, equity, of course, diversity and inclusion, black, right? All of these are words that make it impossible for us to tell a meaningful story about how the society came to look the way it did, and it becomes obvious they don't want you to tell that story. What is to be gained by not being able to tell the story? Naturalizing racial hierarchy. It's just the way things are. And now it's become abundantly clear. One of the executive orders says that the whole idea behind social construction of race, to say that race is not biological. All of that material is improper ideology. It's improper to actually point to the ways that race was constructed and rationalized, that what was done to us became a feature of who we were, right? We were made into enslavable people, and that meant that we could never be citizens. None of that is to be told or criticized anymore. And in case we're unclear about how this is feeding into censorship, look at the books that were taken out of the Naval Academy.
Yes.
I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, off the shelves. How Racism Takes Place, off the shelves. What's still on the shelf?
Mein Kampf.
Mein Kampf. What's still on the shelf? The bell curve. So this isn't about just censorship. Censorship is a tactic towards a particular end. And when we don't talk about that end, we're flat-footed in a period like this. When it's clear what can be censored, anti-racism can be censored, equity, justice, and inclusion can be censored. Racism is not censorable. In fact, people can be embraced and held up as a national hero for articulating racism. So it is 100% clear what this agenda is. That means that the fight now, as you said, the fight is in the house. The call is coming from inside the house. It's not outside. So when people tell us that we have to accept these as the new conditions of political reality, they're basically telling us that the new face of disenfranchisement is not having an option, not having a choice, not having a place where the values that we need to survive are actually supported in real time. So for us, what that means in terms of the work, so what else will we write? But also, how do we take this to cinematic storytelling? How do we take this to other places? At the African American Policy Forum, one of the things we've done for the last 5 years after January 6th is to do the story of us. How has cinematic storytelling contributed to the ideology of people who were marching through that Capitol? We've also marched to support the Smithsonian, the idea that we can erase your history by taking away the artifacts. And once we erase your history and we erase your story, you have no justification for expecting anything other than what you've gotten. That is the kind of work that has to be done now. And frankly, sometimes it's work that we have to do with our own folks who are perfectly willing to think that they can just wait this out. This is not like a flu. It's not going to pass. There's no natural end to this. It ends only when we start fighting with everything we've got, like our lives depend on it, because as we've all been saying, they really do.
It's like that line from, I believe it was Reverend Shuttlesworth, I don't want to misquote, where it said, why did they need a movement? And he said, because rattlesnakes don't commit suicide. And so I know we have there's a lot more that we could get into. And I really want to thank you just for your contributions to this conversation today and all the things that you've done ahead of this conversation today. And, there's more, struggle continues, and thank you.
Thank you, Jelani.